Story 1. Allison's favorite holiday was Halloween. Even at the age of 21, she never grew out of the Halloween spirit. She still dressed up in scary costumes, went to pumpkin patches with her friends, and even enjoyed the horror movie marathons that played all October long. But this Halloween was a little different. Because of her demanding career in pharmaceuticals, Allison was now living in a small town in Pennsylvania that was over 2 hours away from her family and friends. That meant most holidays and birthdays she spent celebrating them alone. However, being the optimist that she proudly was, she decided that this Halloween, she was going to thoroughly enjoy herself, despite being alone from family and friends. These were her exact thoughts that Halloween evening as she made her way up the path to her front door. Kids in costumes were shouting for joy houses down as the neighbors handed out candy. Hurrying her pace, not wanting to miss the joy of giving candy out to the trick-or-treaters, Allison unlocked her front door and opened it. Before she stepped in, there, shoved under her welcome mat, was a white envelope. Curiously, Allison bent over and picked it up. There was no return address and only 2 words written on the front. For Allison, wondering who would have left this here, she tore open the envelope, pulled out a letter, and began reading it. Dear Allison, how are you? I hope all is well and you're enjoying your new home. I'll keep this brief because there isn't much time. Tonight, Halloween night, be sure by 10 p.m. to lock all your doors and windows. And whatever you, do not answer your door after 10 p.m. I don't care what you hear or what you think you hear. Do not open your door. Things beyond both our comprehensions will occur, and you must not open the door at any cost. Please, heed my warnings. I only wish your well-being. Be safe, stay strong, and do not open your door after 10 p.m. With love, your Aunt Cynthia. Allison read and reread the letter. She glanced up and down her street, trying to identify a prankster or mischief. She didn't have time to worry about this poor attempt at a cheap scare. Not only did she not have an Aunt Cynthia, but the trick-or-treaters were only 3 houses away, and she needed to prepare the candy bowl. It was her first Halloween in this neighborhood, and she wasn't going to be the neighbor who neglected the children their sugar rush. She made her way inside, her mind quickly occupied with the Halloween joy, trick-or-treaters, and a night of handing out candy. Any thoughts of ominous warnings and cheap scares were long gone. Times. By 9:15 p.m., Allison's candy bowl was nearly empty. Despite being alone, she was having a great Halloween night. She bounced back and forth from answering the trick-or-treaters and watching the horror movie marathon on TV while enjoying a glass of red wine. By 9:45 p.m., she decided to call it quits. There hadn't been a trick-or-treater for nearly an hour. This was a young neighborhood after all. Most of the kids were all sugared out and in bed. Plus, John Carpenter's Halloween was the next movie on TV, and she did not want to miss 1 second of that. She quickly got up and went to turn off her front porch lights, signaling to any trick-or-treaters out there that she was closed for business. As she made her way to the front door, she noticed that it was 10 p.m. The letter's ominous warning came flooding back to her memory, but in her wine-induced state of being, she simply laughed at the poor attempt of a scare. As her hand went to the switch that would turn off her front porch lights, there was suddenly a knock at the door. Trick or treat. Allison heard from the other side of the door. She reached for the doorknob and almost opened it. Almost. There was something odd about the voice. Something off. Allison cleared her throat. Sorry, all out of candy. She expected whoever was at the door to go away. What she did not expect was to see her door knob begin to turn. She quickly turned the lock and slid the deadbolt across. I said, I'm all out of candy. I'm sorry. Try another house. Silence hung there like a dense fog. Allison, open the door. The wine, but she was enjoying all night, dissipated. She took a step back and pulled out her phone. If you don't leave, I'm calling the police. There was another long drawn-out pause. Allison, We both know they can't help you." Her front door shook violently. The frame's siding even began to splinter, with chips spilled to the ground. In a haste, she dialed 911. When she painstakingly explained her situation, that's when the violent attempt to break in ceased. There was an eerie calm. Allison sprinted into the kitchen and grabbed a steak knife. She opened her front door an inch to see if the maniac was still there, and that's when she saw the red and blue flashing lights. Cop cars and ambulances were scattered on the street and lawn of her next-door neighbor's house. She opened her door wider to analyze the situation. A cop came sprinting over to her. "Ma'am, please lock all your doors and windows and stay inside for the night." Allison obliged, but not before noticing that the officer's uniform was covered in dark red. She relocked her door and sat on her living room couch, waiting for sleep to come. It never did. Times. The next morning, the local news had the answers to Allison's questions. The newscaster was calling it the Haloween massacre. Allison's next-door neighbors, the Doyles, were mutilated beyond recognition. They were a family of 6, a mom and dad, and 4 kids, all gone from this earth. What was worse, the newscaster explained, was that there was no fingerprints, no DNA, or any other forms of evidence left behind. Just a family massacred with no explanation how. Allison watched the news unfold throughout the morning, tears stinging her eyes. She scrambled through her kitchen trash until she found it, the letter left on her mat. She dialed her mother, burning with questions. "Do I have an Aunt Cynthia?" There was a pause. "Allison, is everything all right? Where is this coming from? Answer the question. Do I have an Aunt Cynthia?" Allison heard her mother gulp. "Technically, yes." "Who is she? Why have I never met her?" Her mother sighed. "Sweetie, Cynthia was my younger sister. When she was born, her neck caught around the umbilical cord. She suffocated." Allison froze to the spot, her aunt's letter in hand. That's when she noticed that there was more writing on the back that she hadn't noticed before. She turned the letter over and read, "Sweetie, there's always been good and evil on the earth. It's up to us to protect our loved ones from the evil. We've never met, not in this life, but I am the guardian of your life. That's what family does. Stay blessed, Allison, and stay safe." Allison folded the letter to her chest. Her Aunt Cynthia was her guardian angel, and Story 2. I know why cemeteries are locked every Halloween. And cemeteries are always locked on Halloween. It makes sense, doesn't it? The temptation to sneak into a cemetery on Halloween and do stupid shit is more than most kids can resist. That's why our town cemetery is padlocked and the tops of its gate are spiked. Keeps the pesky kids out during the time of the year when they'd most like to do damage. Almost fell for that one, did you? Any parent knows that there's nothing you can do to keep kids out of dangerous places. Kids have a habit of finding every single nook and cranny they can possibly shove their tiny, flexible bodies through and getting themselves into the most idiotic of trouble. There's really no preventing it, but we still try, don't we? That's why we put up fences and warnings around construction zones. That's why we put grates over sewers. And that's why we lock cemeteries on Halloween. And true to form, some idiot kid will sneak it on Halloween. Anyway, maybe they'll spray some shitty graffiti over some poor bastard's grave. Maybe there's some edgy wannabes try and hold seances with electric candles. Or maybe they're just curious and have never heard the old adage about the cat. I was among the latter. I'll keep my introductions brief and to the point. My name is Samuel, Sammy for short. I grew up in Little Ford, Minnesota, a small city without too much to do or see. My best friend was a girl named Anna Thompson, who lived kitty corner from me. She and I were 13 years old when we broke into Greenwood Cemetery. There was no reason for it, really. It was Halloween and we were bored. Too young for parties, too old for trick-or-treating. Our parents had gone to some gathering at City Hall, and we were left to our own devices. They assumed we'd spend the night watching horror movies in Mr. and Mrs. Thompson's living room. It was on a whim that we changed plans and did something we knew could get us into serious trouble. That, of course, was most of the appeal. So we grabbed a few flashlights along with our coats and headed down the road. The cemetery was only a few blocks away, its presence marked by the high spikes of its wrought iron gate. It glowed in the pale moonlight like a warning, but neither of us paid any attention to it. It was actually pretty easy to scale the fence, so long as we were careful up at the top. It took about 10 minutes for both of us to drop down into the cemetery. We stood on its outskirts, our view mostly obscured by the giant trees that lined the cemetery boundaries. "Now what?" asked Anna, just a little out of breath. She never could keep up with me. I shrugged. I hadn't really thought that far ahead. "Let's walk around, see if we find anything interesting. Maybe there were some other kids messing around out there." I secretly thought it would be fun to play hide-and-go-seek in the darkness of a cemetery. At least, as long as the other kids didn't think it was stupid. So we weaved our way through the trees, relying on our flashlights to see a few scant feet in front of us as a cloud passed over the moon and left us shrouded in darkness. We had managed to stumble our way through the trees for about 20 minutes or so when, suddenly, Anna stopped and held her breath. "Listen," she hissed, grabbing my arm so hard that it hurt. "Do you hear that?" At first, I didn't hear anything but the rustling of leaves in the wind. I was about to say so when another sound crept into my ears, barely perceptible, but they're all the same. It was impossible to distinguish what it might be, but my curiosity was piqued. "Let's go," I said, sliding her grip down to my hand. Truth is, I'd always found Anna pretty, with her wavy blonde hair and green eyes. I was glad she couldn't see me blush in the dark. We walked towards a sound, or at least where we thought it might be coming from. It was so quiet, it was hard to tell. However, the longer we walked, the louder it got. As the sound became more distinct, we both realized that it was agony. It was a cacophony of moaning and crying, and maybe even a little begging. Anna began to shake a little as the sounds increased in volume. "Hey, I don't like this. Let's get out of here," she said. Abruptly, I turned around and dragged her along, anxious to get away from the noise. However, no matter which way we turned, all the tormented wailing became louder and louder until it was almost painful to hear. I realized that Anna was crying beside me. I could feel in the way her hand shook in mine, but I couldn't hear it over the noise. I could feel the beginnings of a panic attack overcoming me when, all at once, the moon burst out from behind the cloud and illuminated the cemetery. Somehow, we had managed to find ourselves smack dab in the middle of the graveyard, surrounded by a sea of crumbling headstones. We were in the older part of the cemetery, it seemed, based on the quality of the stones, at least those that still existed. What caught my attention, however, wasn't the tombstones, but what was attached to them. Writhing in the dirt was a mass of bodies, each scrabbling desperately against the ground. A chain wrapped around each waist, linking its victim back to a stone close behind it. I took in the scene around me, finding it impossible to understand what I was seeing. A sharp, high-pitched cry brought my attention down towards my feet. I saw a little girl, no more than 6 or 7, sobbing in the dust. She was chained to a stone that was twice as large as she was. My God, I thought, that must weigh a ton. She seemed as though she was trying to rip it out of the ground, although her pitiful muscles couldn't so much as budge it. She cried out to me in a language I couldn't understand, reaching for me as though I could save her from torment. Without thinking, I reached down and grasped her hand, only to find that I passed through her form as though it was nothing but air. She began to weep and wail with abandon, and my heart sank as I realized that I could not help her. Suddenly, all of the spirits in that cemetery seemed to sense Anna and my presence. They all reach for us, crying out for us, their ghostly hands passing through our skin, leaving us untouched. Their screams and sobs ripped through the night air, tearing our last vestiges of control into shreds. I let go of Anna's hand. I turned to run out of the cemetery, stumbling and falling over a few headstones in my path, knocking out one of my teeth on the ground in the process. I could hear Anna screaming behind me, begging me not to leave her, but I was deaf to her cries. I had to get out of there. Out of everything that happened that night, that's what I regret the most. I got out of the cemetery. I remember every agonizing second trying to scale the fence, thinking back to how those hands had pulled at me desperately, wondering what would have happened if they had been capable of touching me. The thought made me so sick that I stopped along the way to throw up in some bushes. After that, I ran home, locked the doors, and burrowed myself under the covers of my bed. My parents still weren't home. I don't know what happened to Anna that night in the cemetery. She must have gotten out and back home before her parents knew she was gone, because neither one of us was caught. But she wasn't the same after that. She never spoke to me again, of course, a treatment that I fully deserved. Her parents must have noticed the melancholy that had descended over her as well, because they moved a few months later, probably hoping a change of scenery would bring her back to them. I wonder if it did. I'm too afraid to go looking for that answer. I looked for the other answers. Instead, when I was 15, I went back to that cemetery once more, by the light of day this time. I wandered through its uneven expanse until I saw a large tombstone, one that I recognized. It wasn't necessarily very distinct, just a large angel girl staring up at the sky, but it was burned into my brain. Everything from that night was. The girl's name was Sophia. Her last name was too faded to make out. The epitaph was in another language, perhaps German. I could only make out one date, 1862. I don't know why this all matters so much, but it does. When I was 17, I stumbled across a passage in a book, something that jumped out at me from an otherwise boring work. It went a little something like this. They say that God hates pride, and thus he hates monuments to men. That is why your gravestone must be small and modest, for every person is tied to their stone, and upon your death, it will be your task to drag it to heaven with you. Some spirits spend eternities chained to their stones, pulling in vain and crying for salvation to a God that is deaf to their pleas. And the living are powerless to save them. At that last line, my mind flashed back to Sophia, reaching out to me in desperation. I didn't know what to make of God and modesty and pride and monuments. I still don't even know. Of all that happened that night, I only know one thing for certain. I know why cemeteries are locked every Halloween.